Today I'm delighted to welcome our guest presenters, Ellie from Barclaycard and Perna from Clearbank, who will share their perspectives and experience. Barclaycard and Clearbank are very different businesses, so maybe we'll see a contrast, or maybe we'll see some similarities in terms of their perspective. Our MC for today will be Jeff Courtney, who will introduce himself momentarily. There will be a breakout session after the core content. In the breakout session, which will be hosted by your Artesian team, we'll ask you to respond to what you've heard, and maybe share your own experience so that we can learn from each other. And then we'll collectively report back at the end, and each attendee will receive an executive summary. Today, we've got representation from over 20 financial institutions with 70% of you at director level or above. So let's hope we can all benefit from our collective experience. I'll now hand you over to Jeff, and welcome to today.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm really excited about today. I've worked in large banks, I've worked in medium-sized banks, and I've worked with startups and tech companies. And I think today's conversation is timely. And I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation with Ellie and Perna. Just a few logistics and housekeeping points before we jump in. If you can, please stay on mute, but keep your cameras on so we can all see your lovely faces. During the conversation with Perna and Ellie, we will be recording. And if you find it, you might find it easier to use speaker view during the panel conversation and then gallery view during the breakout. If you have any any questions you would like me to pose, please feel free to send them through the chat function, and I will weave them into the conversation. We will have survey polls that pop up on your screen. You don't need to do anything. They will appear automatically. Give us your best answer. All of this will be anonymous, absolutely completely anonymous, and that'll happen throughout the conversation. When we're all whisked away magically to our individual breakout rooms, again, you won't need to do anything. Rob will take care of that. And right before we come back to the common room, to the common Zoom breakout room, you'll be given a little bit of a notice period, but again, you won't need to do anything. This is all Chatham House rules. And with that, looking forward to this, and let's jump in and kick off. Ellie and Perna, welcome.
Thank you.
To get started here, I was wondering, could you just each both give us kind of a 60-second snapshot of your career and how that informs your perspective today? And then off the back of that, these are crazy times, but over the next 6 months, what are you looking forward to? Whether that's professionally, that's personally, what's one thing you're really excited about over the next 6 months? Ellie, if you want to kick off.
Sure, yeah. Hi everyone, afternoon. Ellie Maximise in the Breakout commercials. So I currently am head of client coverage for our corporate issuing business, which is basically leading a sales function looking after large corporate customers with their card and payment solutions. Although my remit is actually shortly due to expand to include the acquiring side of the car business as well, which is quite exciting. Previous to my time at Barclaycard, I spent about 10 years working in other parts of the Barclays group. And previous to that, I've got background into the mortgage and insurance. So always very finance focused, but actually always primarily, I'd say the key genre of my career is sales and sales leadership. So I think that's my key interest in this really. I'm always really focused on relationships, how we build and maintain effective relationships and really get the most out of them. And then what I'm excited about next 6 months, I'll give one of each. So personally, I'm a keen runner, so I'm obviously been devastated with all the running events that were cancelled in 2020. So really looking forward to running events happening again. I've got a marathon scheduled for March, which I've got fingers crossed will go ahead. And then professionally, I'm just really looking forward to and really hopeful for eventually being able to get back to face-to-face meetings and just having that engagement in a face-to-face environment, seeing people in 3D, but also taking some of the learns. I think if we apply our learns from the pandemic, we can make those interactions much more effective.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And Perna, how about for yourself? 60-second snapshot and how that informs your perspective now, and what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, hello everyone. So my name is Prerna Goyal. I'm head of customer experience at Clearbank. I have spent the last decade or so in various operational roles in US, Canada, and UK, predominantly in the payments world. Started out with cards, so I worked at Capital One, and then moved into electronic payments and domestic payments more recently. I'm an engineer by trade, so I have pretty much spent all my life in a very digitally focused, technologically enabled type of organizations. And I think why I'm excited to be part of this conversation is two reasons. One, in all my roles, or in most of my roles, I spend a lot of time working with customers, but also developing and curating partnerships. And I have, as I said, I have been in a very technologically focused organization. So, COVID actually and lockdown actually enabled us to really exploit the power of technology in a very different way. And so I think sharing that experience and actually what kind of a double-edged sword technology creates for us in this kind of an environment is a pretty exciting topic for me, and resonates with me significantly. In terms of what am I excited about, on the personal side, I have recently launched an investment fund in India that's focused on investing in plant-based businesses. So I'm really excited about taking that forward and really making an impact. And on the professional side, I think I'm really curious to see what the new normal looks like. I think we've seen pendulum swing to one end, from one end to the other end. And I think none of us know what that middle ground is going to look like and how organizations actually adapt. So I'm actually very excited about what that new norm looks like and how that's going to drive some permanent changes in all industries, not just finance, which obviously is what we are focused on.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So let's jump in here. Ellie, you mentioned one of the things you're looking forward to is getting back to face-to-face conversations, seeing people in 3D. Looking back. What did you learn? What did your teams learn? What did your organizations learn? And how do you look at taking that forward? What were the positive differences that you've picked up, and how do you think about taking that forward?
Yeah, I think it's very much been a journey. It's very much been a learning journey. Obviously, as Andrew mentioned earlier, none of us expected this. We were all very much hit for six, and I think we absolutely were as well. So I think sort of looking through that journey, the first stage was very much about sort of steadying ourselves. Understanding this new reality, and we have the right systems, right people in the right places. We were actually quite lucky in that our sales organisation was already location independent, so we were all home based, so that was quite a key win in terms of being set up to work from home and to work virtually, so that was a real positive. But then we had to really understand, we kind of went through that soul searching period of what's our strategy, what's important in a COVID world, how has the world changed and evolved. Obviously, how do we protect ourselves, and how do we get that balance between risk and reward whilst still driving growth? We have some really ambitious aspirations. How do we continue to grow, but in a safe environment? And really then looking at who are the winners and who are the losers, and how do we understand that dynamic? We have circa 20,000 corporate customers. Clearly, some of those were facing some kind of real fundamental challenges through COVID. How do we support them? How do we protect them? But then looking at what are the opportunities. So obviously, we've seen quite a lot of opportunity come from a difficult situation as well. Clearly, some businesses are doing really well. Clearly, some businesses are thriving in this environment. So for us, it was about really kind of rebasing, really looking at like how do we use data, how do we use insights, how do we work with those tools at our disposal, as well as our own sort of expertise and knowledge, to make sure we're making really smart decisions. So for us, that's probably been the key thing. How do we decide which baskets we put our eggs in? How do we engage in the right way with the right clients, the right relationships? And like I say, how do we use that data, that insight, that intelligence to really make sure that we can do that in an informed and educated and really compelling way?
Thank you for that. I want to come back to some of those points there that you've mentioned, but just before I do, to pick up with Perna for a second here, you spoke about a little bit in your experience around the double-edged sword of technology and working digitally. In your experience, looking over the past sort of eight or 9 months or so, what have some of those challenges been in the organization? How have you approached them? What have you learned? And what are you taking forward from those learnings, from that kind of double-edged sword perspective?
Yeah, and I think this is probably not unique to the experience we had. I think everybody is feeling the fatigue that comes with being on your computer, 24/7 almost. And I think what was interesting for us at Clearbank was, our demographics is such that we are already quite technically savvy, and we already operated in quite a digital mode. So we had a very flexible model to begin with. But I think there is a big difference between when that flexible model is truly flexible, in the sense that you get an opportunity to go into the office and meet people, and then as needed, you can work from home because you want to focus on certain things, or you want to, get some quiet time to get work done. When it becomes forced, I think it drives a very different behavior and patterns for people, where we suddenly saw this people almost felt a bit guilty about not being on their computers all the time and not being in meetings all the time. And we almost saw this sudden increase in productivity, which obviously was great, but that comes with the concerns about, is that productivity sustainable productivity, and what does that actually mean for people's mental health, and are they actually getting the right downtime? Because if they're not, over a period of time, they're going to start making mistakes, and things are not going to be as they were when people had the opportunity to go into the office and socialize, or actually not be in this transactional mode all the time. So that's what I meant by double-edged sword. Is on one hand, we actually saw a huge improvement in the output. On the other hand, there were some real genuine concerns about just how much time people were spending and how do we keep that momentum up. And actually, over a period of time, we have seen that people are starting to feel fatigued. We are starting to see the concept of social capital, and Jeff, you and I have spoken about this in the past, but the initial momentum was based on all these relationships people had built over a period of time, all of the the social capital that they had built and the goodwill they had built, because they had those informal connections and those social interactions which were now missing. And we have started to see over a period of time the impact of that. You are seeing people are getting less patient in meetings and a lot more transactional than they were when we first started. So really for us, the focus was less about how do we transition into a technically driven and remote work environment. It was more about how do we take care of our people as we go on this journey. And actually that's our biggest focus right now, is how do we create those informal modes of interaction. So, we've focused a lot on creating informal meetings, social events, and we are exploring all kinds of different ways of doing it. There are lots of apps available now. There are lots of platforms out there which companies can promote, and I think that's really helping. Additionally, whenever possible, wherever possible, as lockdown rules relax, we have very strongly encouraged people to go and physically meet their colleagues, because we can't underestimate the importance of those in-person interactions. So I think the experience was slightly different, but I think it brought to life, and this is why I talked about the pendulum was swung for us. It's finding that right balance is going to be so key for organizations to really scale and come out of this as winners, rather than not really making the best use of this opportunity.
Thank you for that. That's fantastic. So I think we've got a poll question now that's going to come up on the screen. There we go. So for your organization, you believe remote working has resulted in great improvements in productivity and relationships, a healthy balance between better productivity and good relationships, good productivity improvements, but kind of a bit more transactional on the relationship side, improvements on the relationship but productivity has suffered, or you've just experienced hyper productivity that actually, if not actively managed, can damage some relationships. If you're able to click there on your opinion. And are we good to move on? Great. There we go. That's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of in that finding that mix. I think finding that balance is a common theme across the audience here. Ellie, you mentioned previously, as you were working through the initial parts of the pandemic and those challenges, you used data, you used insights, really to hone in on where you're going to put your eggs, not all in one basket, but how you're going to allocate time, resources, and energy. Could you talk to us a little bit about that experience in terms of the internal collaboration? So you obviously lead a sales team, but with product partners, operational risk partners, et cetera. How did that evolve? What were some of the challenges you faced, and what worked well in terms of that internal collaboration to then, as an organization, collectively deliver for clients?
So I think that's actually been one of the positives of, it sounds awful to say positive of the pandemic, but certainly the positives of this more virtual world that we find ourselves in is that ability to collaborate. Just the accessibility of people, both internally and externally, but taking internal contacts, for instance, obviously in the pre-COVID world, if we had a really key strategic client meeting and we wanted to wheel the MD of our business in, obviously if he's in New York and the meeting's in London, that's kind of a challenge. In a virtual environment, actually, that's much easier to facilitate. And even just sort of drop-in sessions and those sorts of things, it's much easier to leave a virtual meeting for half an hour to dial into another virtual meeting for half an hour to kind of attend. So I think actually the accessibility of people has been a real positive, and that goes for kind of senior leaders, different departments, external collaborators as well. One of the challenges with that, and I think Fred mentioned it earlier, was the challenge of all of us taking on too much. I think we have all become very busy, and certainly if you're like me and you get FOMO and you want to be sort of involved in everything, and it's much too easy to say yes to everything. So I think that is one of the key challenges with that accessibility, is making sure that both from a wellbeing point of view, as we talked about, but also just from an effectiveness point of view, that we're kind of really strict with all of ourselves around what we take on to make sure that all of those interactions can be most valuable again. But yeah, I actually think that's a real positive of a virtual environment, is that ability to collaborate much more so than previously.
Thank you for that. And Perna, sort of a similar question for you, but thinking about external collaboration, partnerships. So you've developed partnerships clearly before the pandemic, and you've worked with partners during the pandemic. What's that experience been like? What's really worked particularly well? What have you learned? How's it changed or reinforced what you already did and believed about your partnerships?
Yeah, and I think, I have been involved in setting up the Tide partnership for ClearBank, which is obviously a pretty big partnership for us. And I think that's probably a good one to talk about in terms of how I can compare and contrast that with some of the new partnerships we are working on. I think it goes back to the comment I made previously that, where relationships were already existing, it was a lot easier through the lockdown to continue to cultivate those relationships, but a lot of effort had to be made to make sure that we are spending a lot of time together, we're being open, honest, and transparent with each other, even more so than we were previously, because this concept of FOMO is a great point Ellie made. Is it's much easier to feel like you're not getting enough information. It's almost like your brain plays tricks on you, because you're getting the same level of information, but you somehow feel that because you're not having conversations in person, that somehow the information is not coming in a perfect way. So I think, and to be fair, that has translated into new partnerships as well. I think we have had to spend a lot more time with the partners. So a lot more meetings, just getting to know each other, really understanding the culture of the organization and how that fit works. Because I think when you build partnerships in person, there are a lot of intangibles that you get comfortable with when you're meeting somebody in person, or when you're visiting their office, or you're meeting people from various organizations. You get a sense of how the two organizations are going to work together because of those intangible benefits you get when you do it in person. Now, that doesn't translate very well when you are on a Zoom call, and let's put it bluntly, most people are distracted on Zoom calls because messages are pinging and emails are coming. So I think what the biggest difference we've seen is we've had to spend a lot more time on trying to figure out those intangibles and trying to figure out what looks good on paper, is it actually going to work well in reality? And I think the types of techniques we have used are just spending a lot more time, having more informal meetings, not making every meeting to have an agenda, because then it becomes very transactional, it becomes very business-like. It's trying to create those, mimic those informal catch-ups that you have, in person, in a remote setting. So I think that's probably been the biggest difference I've seen. And I think we have had to apply it to existing relationships as well, just to make sure they continue to remain strong. But I think you do benefit from those initial connections you have made when you're just continuing to manage a relationship versus you're building out a new partnership.
Yeah, thank you. That's insightful. And we'll come back to some of those points in a second here. But for now, if we can have a second poll question. There we go. So collaboration with colleagues and partners while working remotely, has it been stronger than ever as everyone kind of pulls together to deliver for clients? You've got that sort of shared resilience dynamic going, or has it remained strong as you've embedded good practices with new approaches and tools? So it's been good and balanced. Has it not changed materially in terms of the way you collaborate with colleagues and external partners? Did it start well, but actually you're finding it difficult to maintain without face-to-face engagements? Or frankly, has it just been difficult and challenging, and it is what it is? There we go. So we've got a little bit broader set of answers here. Thank you for that. That's interesting. And we will be sharing these afterwards. Okay, so we've got one more question here before we break out. We'll have one more question with Ellie and Perna, and a poll question before we go into the breakout rooms. But just to pick up there, Perna, on what you were saying, existing relationships and new relationships. So what has your experience been this past year when it comes to deepening those existing relationships, as well as developing new relationships? What have you found effective? What's been the most challenging? And to be quite blunt, is it possible to really develop good new relationships while working remotely over Zoom? Ellie, how's that been for you and your team?
Yeah, I think you touched on an interesting point. I think new relationships are by far more difficult to develop in a virtual world than maintaining existing ones. So I think we have to kind of think quite smart about those. But when it comes to existing ones, I think it's I tend to think of it in this current environment that we need to do the same but better. And actually, one of the interesting things that I realised quite early on, and one of the sort of journeys that me and my team have been on, was kind of resetting some of the best practices, some of the good practices that we would have previously done in a normal world. So in a way, it's really easy to, or it's much easier to maintain a relationship in a virtual environment, but actually it's quite easy to fall into bad habits and not have that distinction between what's a meeting that should perhaps be quite structured and be really clear on our objectives and what's just a catch up. And some of that was having rose-tinted glasses, right? Some of that was believing that the original lockdown was only going to be 3 weeks and then we were going to be back to normal, so we were kind of treading water. And you get to that point where you have to think, right, this is the new normal for the foreseeable future. So how do we make the most of it? So I think getting back to some of those basics is really important. But then how do we elevate? So I think in a virtual environment, things have to be much more concise, much punchier, much more engaging, much more compelling. We talked about that challenge of distractions in a Zoom meeting. How do you keep that attention in a face-to-face meeting? But the one thing you've got is attention. But actually in a virtual environment, you don't know what's going on in the background. So I think, how do we make sure that message is really clear? And particularly often we're dealing with less time as well. I think that's one of the key things, that you're often offered less time. So how do we think differently and think smarter? So, and just simple things, like a recent example yesterday, for instance, we were doing a prep session for a key client meeting, and we're running through kind of the usual, and obviously on the agenda is introductions, and actually we looked at the attendees, and there's kind of 25 attendees going to be on this meeting, so that's going to be like half the meeting taken up just with everyone introducing themselves. So we just completely changed that tact and put in a slide with your Breakout team and what everyone's roles and responsibilities are, and just have one person give a 1 minute overview for that. So just really trying to think differently, be smarter. How do we get the best? How do we make the best use of time? And then, as I say, I think new relationships are much more challenging. So again, it's how do we think smarter? How do we think different? How do we use data and insights, and tools like Artesian are fantastic for this, to really get to understand what's important to our customers, what's important to individuals, what's hot right now, so we can engage with a sort of really compelling, really timely message that's going to really start that relationship in the right way and create that level of attention and engagement.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I like that. You know, do the basics well, but elevate. That's very, very nicely said. So Perna, for you, how has that been in terms of existing new relationships and the challenges associated with both? What have you found effective, and how have you gone about that as an organization?
Yeah, I think for me, I think the biggest learning is the importance of being visible. I think what I mean by that is, when you're in an office environment, you're walking around, you're on the floor, you see people clock you, people know you are there, and there is this implicit connection that happens. I think that's very difficult when you're just going from one meeting to the other. So it's very important. I think the importance of having catch-ups and one-to-ones with people at all levels of the organization has never been more important in my opinion, right? And I think in the past, you know, we have daily meetings with our teams, or regular meetings with our clients. You may not show up to all of them, and you still know that you still have that connectivity with them. Whereas now it's so critical to show up to all of those. It's so critical to be, you know, putting your camera on, simple things like that, right? I think that the energy of a meeting is completely different when people are on the camera versus if people are off camera. So I think just putting some of those basics, going back to making sure you're having regular catch-ups, making sure you're showing up to those catch-ups, and making sure you're fully engaged and making that effort, I think has been the biggest success factor for us as an organization, and doing it in different ways at different times and different formats, because you have to keep keeping it interesting for people, otherwise people won't engage. So, you know, we've tried all kinds of, as I said, different things at team level, at organization level. We've organized events with customers, which, you know, just making sure you stay connected in a very visible manner, I think is probably one of the biggest learnings, and probably has been the biggest reasons for success for us.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Thank you. Thanks both of you for your sharing your insights and your experiences today. We have our final poll question here. So when it comes to deepening existing relationships and building out new ones while working remotely, existing relationships are stronger today, but building new relationships is really unrealistic? Or do you believe existing and new relationships evolve case by case, and actually it's really difficult to generalize? Or both are challenging, and we are getting better at both, but we still have room to improve as an organization? Or there's a focus. This is a focus area where you look forward to improving over the next months and years. There we go. Well, that concludes the conversation portion here of the event today. So again, thank you, Ellie and Perna. Really insightful. Thank you for sharing your experiences. Great, kind of contrasting but complementary, I think. We're now going to go into breakout rooms, and Rob, by the magic of Zoom, will whisk you away to your breakout rooms. Well, you'll have a facilitator and some time to just talk about what you've heard, your perspectives, and questions the facilitator poses. And then we'll all be coming back to the common Zoom room to summarize and wrap up. Breakout rooms. Just in terms of doing a roundup around the feedback, we had a couple of facilitators who would like to jump in and start with the feedback. Andrew, go for it.
I took the opportunity to ask each of the breakout participants a question. I asked the first question about maximising relationships during the pandemic. And Pat from NatWest came up with a great saying. He said, initially, we grouped around shared adversity, but as we get into, he called it lockdown season 2. He is a Kiwi. He said, the fatigue begins to set in, and from that we start to think about new initiatives, new ways. So new agendas. So that was quite interesting. I spoke to a gentleman from Cambridge and Counties, Robert, who believed that things had fundamentally not changed in their world, because their relationships were driven through intermediaries and were still as strong as they were before. So it was about the relationship manager and the intermediary. Talked to Neil, who talked about hyper productivity at the start of the pandemic, and now people settling into the new norm. And I asked about the informal relationships. The thing that Neil said he missed the most was, venturing to the coffee shop and bumping into a plethora of colleagues and that whole kind of interaction therein. So that was feedback from our side.
Thank you for that. And I know William and Ashley from your groups who would like to jump in.
I can jump in. I was in. Me and Ashley were in a breakout.
Yeah. We ran out of time pretty quickly on that. It goes quickly, doesn't it? Oh.
No, jump in, Will, or shall we go? We obviously, me and Jaslyn were in the same.
Go on, I'll go.
So as we go for technology is sometimes an issue when we're working remotely, and things don't always flow smoothly.
Ashley, why don't you take it? William's having some challenges.
So, I mean, we had a very general chat, and I think a lot of us looked at a lot of the benefits that have happened about, the time saving and the fact we could actually have more conversations than we could previously. But then also some of the negatives that those general conversations you'd have with people from other teams that just weren't able to interact with them. Like me and Jasmine were saying, I speak to our team very much, but the development team that's at the other side of the office, normally that I'd pop and have a 5-minute chat over the kitchen, is just not happening. So
and we also spoke about one of the positives that we feel has come out of the situation is about the opportunities that have been opened internally within organizations. So previously, if a head office of an organization was based somewhere farther away from where you lived, you probably wouldn't be applying for that role. Whereas now the roles available are more for the right person rather than the area in which you live. So whether you live in Europe or whether you live in London or in England, it doesn't matter. If you're right for that role, that opportunity is more available for you. So that's one key positive that has been seen amongst all of us when we were talking in the breakout room.
Thank you. That's insightful and not something we've really touched on in terms of skill and role mobility. So thank you for that. William, how's the...
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So yeah, sorry about that. We didn't end up with very much time. It does go by quickly, but we got Dan to mention. Dan, I don't know if you want to share directly. So we talked about highs and lows in terms of collaboration over the last 8 months, and Dan had some interesting ones from his role in Equinity.
I just said, didn't mean to take all the time up. Was that we focused on setting up a thing called EQ Leads, which just enabled rebranding it, I guess, re-highlighting it, just to try and push the idea of focusing on existing relationships. It depends on your corporation structure. Ours is quite siloed into the different divisions. So in order to sort of say, well, if you've got a client who's got an issue, think about the rest of the products we've got, create the relationship, do the introduction, and then if that goes through, then there's a reward there for the salesperson. So rather than, given that, chasing new clients for certain parts of the business is quite hard at the moment, that idea of trying to utilize the long list of clients, that existing clients that we had, was something really positive. And we've had a couple of very strong campaigns that have run through those that have been really successful for us, and supporting our clients with products that they didn't sometimes even know that we had. The other side of the conversation, which was the downside, I just think I get to sit on quite a lot of the various teams meetings due to my role, and what I'm seeing is just that the actual management of the sales team, just the sort of human factor, is missing a bit, and that people are starting to struggle. At first, I think it was highlighted, I'm trying to remember which one said it, but that this was only going to be a few weeks, we'll wait and see, might have been Ellie, but actually it's gone on and on and on, and there's just that human factor that people are just finding it a bit of a grind, but boring, but this and that. So I can see that the sales teams leads are just having to do a bit more management and just a bit more caring of their teams, and just making sure everybody's all right, because you don't, as somebody just said, you don't get to go down for a coffee and just all that sort of natural stuff that we're used to having.
It's great.
Great, thank you for that. So thank you, everyone. That kind of brings the overall event now to conclusion. Just in terms of a wrap-up observation, this has been really insightful. I think two phrases kind of stuck in my mind. One is the idea of doing the basics better, but then elevating. And I think that's come through in a lot of the conversations. There are opportunities to collaborate more effectively. We just heard a great example there in terms of internal collaboration that then helps deliver better solutions, more appropriate products for clients, things that you might not have considered, might not have thought during sort of BAU times, but this new environment, it does enable that. So getting the basics right, whether it's mental health, managing your team, managing the interpersonal dynamics, managing collaboration, but then elevating that, because we do have opportunities through technology. Then on the flip side, managing the double-edged sword. You don't have the informal coffee catch-up. It takes a lot more effort, frankly, to deepen, to maintain, to build the relationships, and recognizing and actively managing that double-edged sword. Those are two of the phrases that really struck with me over the last hour. Again, I want to thank Ellie and Perna for sharing your insights and your experiences. That was wonderful. Give you a virtual round of applause if we could. And thank you to Artesian for sponsoring this and for bringing us together today. Have an excellent rest of your afternoon, everyone, and thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
See you
Bye-bye.
soon.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.